The 3rd of May 2019 was one of those days that just seemed to be cursed, especially to the pilots of Miami Air International Flight 293. Miami Air was a charter airline that operated a fleet of Boeing 737s for groups like sports teams, corporate events, as well as the US military, which had contracted them to operate regular flights to the US naval station in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Many base personnel, their families, civilian contractors, lawyers for detainees and other visitors to Gitmo relied on these flights to get to and from this isolated base, but the flights weren't always reliable. And on this particular day, things were going wrong from the very start. The captain, which had been rostered for command on this flight, was 55 years old and had about 7,500 total hours, including 2,200 on the Boeing 737. He had moved from Argentina to the United States in the middle of his career and had therefore been forced to earn his ratings all over again. But he had managed to do that without any issues and had passed everything. Now, years later, he had risen up the ranks at Miami Air, becoming a ground and simulator instructor, line check airman, and even an FAA aircrew designee, which allowed him to conduct pilot certificate examinations on behalf of the authority. But the first officer that he was going to share the cockpit with on this day was much less experienced. He was 47 years old and had also come from Argentina with a similar background as the captain and the same number of total flight hours, about 7,500. But he had spent most of his career flying small planes and working as a freelance flight instructor before eventually being hired by Miami Air. And on the day of this flight, he had accumulated only 18 hours of experience on the Boeing 737, which was also the first jet aircraft that he had ever flown. In fact, he was so new that he was still undergoing his initial operating experience, or IOE, which was why the captain, in his role as a line check airman, was expected to supervise him and evaluate his performance. Both pilots had then started their duty on the 3rd of May at a hotel in Jacksonville, Florida, where the captain woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and then met up with the first officer before reporting for duty at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, right on time at 07:55 for the morning flight down to Guantanamo. Out on the ramp, they then later also met the aircraft that they were going to fly on that day, an 18-year-old Boeing 737-800. The oldest one in Miami Air's fleet. Now, the technical log didn't show any major issues, but when the pilots boarded and started their pre-flight checks, they noticed that the left thrust reverser fault light was illuminated. Now, the thrust reversers help slowing the plane down on landing or after a rejected takeoff, but they aren't normally required for dispatch. In fact, we often don't even count them when calculating our landing distance, and it's legal to land with both thrust reversers inoperative in good or better runway conditions. Nevertheless, the captain told the mechanic to try and troubleshoot the issue, but that mechanic couldn't get the light to go away, so the crew just wrote it up in the technical log and declared that the left reverser was inoperative in accordance with the minimum equipment list, or MEL. Now, the MEL is a document that gives us pilots references to what items are allowed to be inoperative for flight and what, if any, special procedures that we need to follow. After then finishing the pre-flight checks and reviewing the dispatch paperwork and weather, the pilots finally pushed back, but they didn't get very far before a new fault appeared. While taxiing out to the runway and with their takeoff clearance already in hand, both air conditioning ducts suddenly lost pressure, one after the other, indicating a loss of bleed air from the engines. Now, without bleed air pressure to the air conditioning packs, they wouldn't be able to control the temperature inside of the plane, nor pressurize it normally, so the captain decided to just taxi back into the ramp and get it sorted. But once again, the mechanics were unable to fix the problem, so the captain wrote up both bleed air systems as inoperative and then followed the procedure in the minimum equipment list for flight without engine bleed air. That required the use of the auxiliary power unit in the back, the APU, to supply air pressure to one of the two air conditioning packs. Now, the APU isn't normally used in flight and could only supply bleed air pressure up to 17,000 feet, so the crew now had to refile their flight plan for that altitude and obviously also recalculate their fuel burn. From my view, the idea of an airline allowing a passenger flight in high temperatures with no working bleed air sounds a little bit wobbly to me, but apparently it was okay in this case. But that also wasn't the only part of this story that raised some question marks regarding Miami Air, at least for me, but the final report didn't really address the airline's safety culture at all. Anyway, after completing all of those tasks, the pilots finally taxied back out to the runway and took off into the sweltering Florida heat, now a full 4 hours behind schedule. The plan had originally been to fly down to Guantanamo, pick up the passengers, take them back to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, and then continue on to Norfolk, Virginia. But due to this delay, the airline had decided to cancel that third leg. But even then, completing the leg back to Jacksonville would push the crew close to the edge of their legal duty time. So with all of this hanging over their head, they completed the flight down to Guantanamo Bay, landed at Leeward Point Airfield without any issues, and then taxied into the ramp. After that, all the inbound passengers disembarked, and most of them likely switched on their mobile phones to try and find a Wi-Fi network, which I think is something we all do from time to time. Just use whatever network is available without thinking about the potential risks. You see, if you join a public Wi-Fi network without any precautions, anyone on that network can potentially see what you're doing. So they don't even need to be skilled hackers to access things like your password, personal details, or credit card information. That's why I use today's sponsor, NordVPN. And something I really want to focus on today is their Threat Protection Pro feature. It constantly works in the background, scanning the website you visit before they even load, and if it notices something sketchy, like phishing code, malware or trackers, it just blocks the site from loading. This algorithm is trained by Nord's cybersecurity experts and can catch brand new phishing scams basically as soon as they pop up, and they are currently blocking tens of millions of threats every single month. But besides safety, I, and especially my boys, love NordVPN since it's the fastest VPN on the planet, which grants us access to all the stuff that we need from back home, especially when we're traveling. So to try it out, scan this QR code or head over to nordvpn.com/pilot for 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. And remember, they always offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't lose anything out by checking them. Thank you, NordVPN. Now, let's get back to the aircraft that's sitting out there on the apron. At Guantanamo, 136 passengers then boarded the 737, which, in addition to the 2 pilots, 4 flight attendants and a mechanic, brought the total number of occupants up to 143. No further maintenance was performed at Guantanamo, which meant that the return leg was also planned to cruise at 17,000 feet, with the APU supplying a single air conditioning pack. But in that Caribbean heat, with only 1 pack operating, the air conditioning system was now unable to keep up with the demand, and the passengers and crew were therefore left sweltering in the cabin, drenched in sweat. Meanwhile, the pilots again reviewed the dispatch paperwork, which showed that the conditions would be largely clear en route, but also that thunderstorms were now predicted near Jacksonville. A further annoyance for sure, but also perfectly normal for Florida at that time of year. Still, the captain decided that he would act as pilot flying for this leg due to this forecasted bad weather and with the first officer's low experience in mind, which makes perfect sense to me. But remember, the role of the pilot monitoring can be equally important as who is actually flying. As the evening approached, the captain eventually taxied Miami Air Flight 293 out to the runway at Leeward Point, pushed the thrust levels forward and started accelerating for takeoff. Still 4 hours behind schedule, now with a broken thrust reverser and a cabin full of miserable, sweating passengers. This was likely one of those days where the pilots just wished for the day to end, but sadly, the worst was yet to come. Now, to understand the danger that was already starting to develop, we need to talk about the way that landing performance is calculated, especially in bad weather conditions like the one forecasted for Jacksonville that night. You see, when pilots or dispatchers calculate landing performance, they have to use the anticipated conditions and then select a runway that provides an appropriate safety margin above the minimum required to actually stop. Factors that we have to take account for include whether the runway is dry, wet or contaminated, if any brake-in systems are inoperative, whether we plan to use auto brakes or manual brakes, whether there is any headwind or tailwind, the planned landing speed, as well as, of course, the weight of the airplane. At Miami Air, like in most US airlines at the time, dispatchers had calculated the planned landing performance for Flight 293 before it had even taken off, using all of the factors that I just mentioned, plus the inoperative reverser. And they had concluded that regardless of whether the runway was wet or dry, the flight would have plenty of runway to stop safely at their destination. At around 8,000 feet long, or 2,430 meters, Naval Air Station Jacksonville's main runway, 1028, was perfectly suitable for a 737 under most conditions. But how exactly did dispatchers account for the possibility of a wet runway? Well, Miami Air used two different scales to measure braking action. First, a numerical scale, also used in NOTAMs and other official updates, which ran from 0, meaning nil braking action, to 6, meaning perfect. And secondly, pilots reported braking action using the terms excellent, good, fair or medium, poor and nil. When reconciling these scales, good braking action corresponded to 5 on that numerical scale, and the procedure at Miami Air was to assume that braking action on a dry runway was excellent, or 6, while braking action on a wet runway would be good, or 5. Therefore, in light of the thunderstorms that were forecasted in Jacksonville, the dispatcher had used a braking action value of 5 to account for the possibility that the runway would be wet, and with that, everything still worked out fine. Now, whilst the pilots could run the actual landing calculation themselves using the onboard performance tool, or OPT, Miami Air only required them to do so if they switched to a shorter runway, or if the planned landing configuration changed, or if the runway conditions changed unfavorably, like if heavy rain or snow moved in over the field, for example. But that recalculation could also be skipped if all of the following conditions were met. The runway was longer than 7,000 feet, the airport elevation was below 3,000 feet, any tailwind was less than 5 knots, the temperature was below 40 degrees Celsius, braking action was reported as good or excellent, at least one thrust reverser was working, and max manual braking was used. If any of these conditions weren't met and the conditions had worsened, well, then the pilots must recalculate their landing performance using that OPT, at least before landing. Remember that, because it's going to become pretty important. After climbing to the restricted cruise altitude of 17,000 feet, Flight 293 then proceeded uneventfully, heading northwest over the Bahamas towards Florida. The cruise phase was as normal as the circumstances allowed, at least until 30 minutes before landing, when thunderstorms started to rise up in their path, prompting them to request several weather deviations around them. The captain soon also called up Miami Air dispatchers to receive the latest weather at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, which at the time showed wind from 120 degrees at 4 knots, visibility of 10 miles, and cumulonimbus, or storm clouds, to the south and west of the field. Now, those conditions seemed perfectly normal, so the captain briefed the first officer for a GPS-based RNAV approach into runway 10, which would allow them to land with some headwind. So far, so good. But then, at time 21:22, while on descent through 13,000 feet, the Jacksonville approach controller came back onto the radio and told them that they could now expect the reciprocal runway 28, and also that there was now moderate to heavy precipitation on the final approach course for that runway. He then advised them that this change of runway had happened because the wind was now coming from 350 degrees instead, having reversed direction during the preceding few minutes. So the captain now looked down at his weather radar and said, Any chance? I think it looks a lot better coming from runway 10. But the controller replied that he was seeing moderate to heavy precipitation, kind of building on the runway 10 as well, and it's starting at about 5 miles final inbound to the airport. Now, based on that information, the captain decided to indeed prepare and rebrief for an approach into runway 28, and Jacksonville approach then cleared them to continue their descent down to 5,000 feet. But the controller also added that, according to the Navy tower, both runways looked pretty bad, showing moderate to heavy precipitation east and west of the airport. And he then asked the captain whether he would still like to go ahead with the RNAV approach into runway 28 or not. The captain replied that he preferred whichever runway looked better, so the controller simply continued vectoring flight 293 for the runway 28 RNAV approach. At this point, the first officer started to set up the flight management system for runway 28, but before they could fully brief it, the approach controller informed them that the rain was now moving eastbound across the airport, placing more of the storm on the runway 28 approach path. So he now wanted to know if the crew would still prefer runway 10 after all. Now, the captain thought for a moment and then decided that, yeah, he would. So they now reverted back to their original plan, which they had already briefed, and the controller started vectoring them for that approach instead. Here I should say that this is pretty typical for flights in this kind of weather. Thunderstorms have a tendency to move really quickly and can sometimes change direction, so we pilots always have to stay flexible and react to the actual conditions. And that can mean rebriefing and setting up for different approaches multiple times, which both increases fatigue and can sometimes lead to some confusion about what the last briefing actually was. By time 21:37, flight 293 was positioned 7 miles out from the final approach fix and on the final approach course, so the controller now cleared them for the approach and also instructed them to contact the tower at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. After making contact, the radar arrival controller at the Navy tower informed the pilots that they would be provided with precision approach radar monitoring, which is a type of advanced radar monitoring that we don't normally receive in the civilian world. On top of that, the controller also reminded the crew of the missed approach procedure, and he warned them that the short field arresting cable was set up on runway 10. Now, that obviously didn't mean much for these pilots, since the 737 doesn't use that anyway, but whenever they are present, military controllers always inform about it, and they can cause a little bit of a bump when rolling over them. I've actually flown to fields like that myself a couple of times, so I know. Anyway, for the first couple of minutes, this approach seemed perfectly routine. But was it really? Well, by this point, a large red area was likely visible on the weather radar in the cockpit, parked directly over the airport and actually over almost the entire city of Jacksonville. Now, I'm saying probably here because it wasn't specifically mentioned in the report, but it was printed out in the radar charts of the area at the time. FAA guidance and our own training makes it clear that pilots should not attempt an approach that close to a thunderstorm, and that's because these storms can contain a wide variety of dangerous phenomena, including not only lightning, but also powerful wind shears, extreme turbulence and hail, and really, really intense rain. So in these type of circumstances, it's always better to hold for a while and let the thunderstorm pass until any red area is at least 3 miles or more away from the airport. And if that's not possible, well, then we should just divert instead. But I have also seen flights land under these kinds of conditions, and from what I understand, this has especially been a problem in the United States, where very frequent thunderstorms are maybe a little bit more common than they are over here in Europe. But also, while this final report doesn't really say what Miami Air's policy on approaching near thunderstorms was, the FAA's position was definitely that it shouldn't be attempted. Now, these pilots were probably used to encountering thunderstorms given the region that they flew in, and on top of that, they were now approaching their duty time limits at the end of a long and exhausting day where so many things had already gone wrong. So there would have likely been a strong desire to just get down onto the ground and be done with it. That feeling, which I often refer to as get-there-itis, is a sign that you might be able to make some really bad decisions, like landing inside of a thunderstorm, for example. So if you ever find yourself feeling like that, well then, take a deep breath and realize that this feeling in itself is a threat worth considering. But as it turns out, that wasn't the only issue here. Another problem was that as Flight 293 was lining up for its approach, torrential rain was now falling over the field, which peaked at a bone-soaking rate of over 6 centimeters per hour. And to make matters even worse, runway 1028 at Naval Air Station Jacksonville didn't have a grooved surface, which is something that helps channel the water towards the edges and creates a water-free surface for the tires to grip onto. Now, during this type of heavy rain, ungrooved runways are therefore more susceptible to flooding, since the water will accumulate evenly over the entire surface and won't be able to drain away as quickly. But that obviously also begs the question, if a thunderstorm was pouring rain over an ungrooved runway, were the pilots still supposed to assume that the braking action was good? Well, as it turns out, years before Flight 293, the FAA had become aware of a series of runway overrun accidents where aircraft landing on wet runways had experienced braking action that was 30 to 40% worse than had been theoretically anticipated. A variety of factors were present in those accidents, but the most common were active precipitation, smooth runway texture, and a lack of adequate drainage. As a result, back in 2015, the FAA had issued a safety alert for operators, or SAFO, urging US airlines to mitigate this risk by instructing pilots and dispatchers to assume that the braking action would be at best medium or fair when the runway was wet after a heavy shower, instead of assuming just braking action good. Now, this caused a large safety factor to be applied to the calculated stopping distance, which could actually prompt pilots to not land on a shortish runway under this kind of conditions, which was a great thing since, like I said, thunderstorms normally moves away fast, so a few rounds in a holding is normally enough for the worst rain to stop and to allow maybe a few minutes for the water to drain away, mitigating the risk. But the problem here was that when the FAA put out this guidance in 2015, Miami Air had not incorporated it into its training program or its standard operating procedures. So by 2019, when this flight was being done, Miami Air was still telling its pilots to assume that braking action was good if the runway was just wet, even after extreme rainfall. At the same time, though, it should also be mentioned that the FAA's definition of a wet runway ranged from 25% of the surface covered with just a little bit of wetness, all the way up to 100% of the surface being covered with up to 3 millimeters of standing water, which is obviously a very large range with huge differences in braking effectiveness. Anything more than 3 millimeters of standing water meant that the runway should be considered as flooded or contaminated, which corresponded to a braking action anywhere from fair to none at all. But without any braking action report from other pilots or air traffic control, there was no real reliable way for pilots to judge whether the runway was wet or flooded, except by visually observing standing water on the runway, which could be tricky to do. And to make matters even worse, a water depth less than 3 millimeters doesn't automatically mean that braking action is not poor or nil. In fact, a water depth a little below 3 millimeters is easily sufficient to cause a phenomenon known as viscous hydroplaning. The more well-known type of hydroplaning is dynamic hydroplaning, which is where the wheels are lifted off the surface on top of a thin cushion of water. And this happens normally at high speed in greater water depths, where the force generated by the water's resistance exceeds the aircraft's weight, preventing the tires from actually touching the ground. But viscous hydroplaning, on the other hand, can happen with a very thin layer of water, as long as the runway surface is smooth due to the water's lubricating effect. Basically, this is like slipping on the spill on your kitchen floor. This also means that high speed isn't required to cause viscous hydroplaning. In fact, it can even happen while you're taxiing. But high speed definitely makes it worse. So with all of this in mind, let's take another look at the situation faced by the pilots of Flight 293. Nobody else had landed at NAS Jacksonville since the start of the storm, so there was no up-to-date pilot reports regarding the braking action, although the controllers did report heavy rain and a red cell was visible over the airport on the radar. Calculations later showed that on this ungrooved runway and at the observed precipitation rates during Flight 293's approach, there could have been nearly 3 millimeters of standing water on the surface. So, not quite enough to qualify it as flooded, but easily wet enough to degrade braking action or cause viscous hydroplaning. Now, if the pilots had at this point recalculated their required landing distance using the FAA's guidance of medium, the landing distance margins would have been too low for a safe landing. But with Miami Air's SOPs, that would just continue assuming that the braking action was good, their OPT would have therefore told them that it was safe to land. Now, to be clear, the pilots were indeed required to recalculate the landing performance at this point. The conditions had definitely worsened since the dispatcher had first ran the numbers, and the pilots had stated during their briefing that they would use only the standard autobrake setting 2 instead of max manual braking. And that didn't make any kind of sense in this type of weather. On top of that, at time 21:39, the Navy tower informed them that the wind had now shifted again. It was now coming from 240 degrees at 10 knots, giving them a 7-knot tailwind component. And that was above the 5-knot threshold, requiring a recalculation of the landing performance. But despite all of this, these pilots never used their OPT to recalculate their landing distance, which was in violation of Miami Air's SOPs. But also, because of the misleading assumptions about braking action that I just described, even if they would have, they still would have thought that it was perfectly safe to land. Now, we don't know for sure why they skipped that check, but most likely they were quite used to land in these kind of conditions without any problems. In any case, what we do know now, with the benefit of hindsight, is that with almost 3 millimeters of standing water on this ungrooved runway, the conditions were ripe for viscous hydroplaning, and the real braking action was probably poor, which the pilots had no way of knowing. But this is also exactly why we shouldn't approach during thunderstorms in the first place. You just never really know for sure what they might throw at you. So now, Flight 293 was on course for a potential disaster. But one last opportunity to avoid landing still remained, if the pilots would take it. On final approach, just minutes away from landing, Flight 293 was now handed over to the radar final controller for the last phase of the approach. This new controller advised the crew that they should now have wheels down, which is a standard call for a military precision radar monitored approach, but isn't something that we normally hear in the civilian world. In any case, the gear was not yet down at this point, so the first officer hurriedly just put it down and acknowledged the instruction, after which the controller cleared Flight 293 to land. But less than a minute later, the controller warned that according to his radar, they were well above the normal 3 degrees glide path, and a precision approach path indicator or PAPI lights next to the runway would have also been showing the pilot 4 white lights, indicating that they were indeed way too high. The final report doesn't go into why they were so high, but it was most likely due to some combination of the late extension of the high drag devices and the tailwind component. Now, under the stabilized approach concept in this airline, an instrument approach had to be stable by a height of 1,000 feet, and that meant that the plane must be on glide path, aligned with the runway, fully configured for landing with a descent rate no more than 1,000 feet per minute, and with only minimal control inputs needed in order to land inside of the touchdown zone. If any of those criteria wasn't met, well then a go-around had to be executed. At this point, Flight 293 was still a bit away from this 1,000-foot stabilization gate, and they were only half a degree above the glide path, with a descent rate of 1,062 feet per minute and with an airspeed of 158 knots, or 5 knots above the calculated approach speed of 153 knots, so that wasn't that bad. But after having been told that they were too high, the captain now disconnected the autopilot and increased the descent rate to 1,400 feet per minute in an attempt to chase the glide path from above. Meanwhile, the first officer tried to finish reading off the landing checklist, calling out speed brakes armed, landing gear down, 3 green, and flaps 30. But he never moved or checked that the speed brake lever actually was in the armed position. Now this is something known as rhyming the checklist, which is where a pilot just reads through the checklist without actually checking anything. This is very common in high workload situations, and especially with inexperienced pilots, both of which were present here. Remember, this was only the first officer's second day after base training, and the captain should have known that and therefore slowed things down or cross-checked everything thoroughly. But since he was now hand-flying the aircraft and trying to correct the path, he also missed this omission. Maybe you can see the Swiss cheese holes starting to line up here. Now the speed brakes, or spoilers, should be armed so that they automatically deploy on touchdown, spoiling whatever lift is still being produced by the wings and thereby forcing the plane's weight down onto its wheels to increase the effectiveness of the brakes. But that system was now not armed. Heavy rain continued to batter the plane, and the wipers therefore had to be turned on to its maximum setting so that the pilot wouldn't lose sight of the runway lights through the downpour. And seconds later, with the stabilization gate looming, the captain relaxed their descent rate, decreasing it to the maximum allowable of 1,000 feet per minute, whilst their speed decreased to their target value of 153 knots. But as it turns out, that wasn't quite enough. The poppy lights still showed 3 white lights, indicating that they were still just slightly too high. But if the captain thought that he could fix that and fully stabilize the approach, he was wrong, because things were now about to get worse instead. As the plane descended through 1,000 feet, neither pilot called out whether the approach was stable or not, but over the next few seconds the captain kept pitching down in an attempt to fully regain the glide path. But with the tailwind that they now had, this just meant that they didn't have enough drag to keep the speed under control, so the speed now accelerated rapidly, reaching 170 knots, which was well above the target. On top of this speed increase, maybe together with some further turbulence, also now pushed them further above the glide path, and by time 21:41 and 9 seconds, they were once again so far above the poppy that it showed 4 white lights, and that would stay like that until the very end. This meant that this approach was now clearly unstabilized, and it was the first officer's duty to call that out and the captain's to execute a go-around. But neither of those things happened. In their later interviews with the NTSB, neither pilot indicated that they could recall anything abnormal about the approach, which in my mind raises further questions about whether Miami Air was really enforcing adherence to the stabilized approach concept. But later, calculations revealed that even if the approach had been executed flawlessly, the braking action on the ungrooved, water-covered surface was at this point so bad that it would have been impossible to stop the plane within the available runway anyway. And whilst the pilots couldn't possibly have known that, what came next could still have been avoided if they had followed SOPs, like going around when the approach became obviously unstabilized. And if they would have done that, then in the time it would have taken them to come back in for another approach, most of the water probably would have drained away. As the flight descended the last 500 feet, the pilots now also found themselves fighting to stay on course. The plane started to drift sharply to the right, with the captain correcting, but just seconds later the ground proximity warning system started calling out
"Sink rate, sink rate,"
meaning that they were now also descending too quickly, too close to the ground. But instead of going around from this obvious indication that the situation was now deteriorating, the captain just said, I got it, and continued correcting. Moments later, they crossed the runway threshold at a height of 120 feet, more than twice the normal value, was also descending rapidly with an airspeed of 170 knots, 17 knots too fast, and also with a further about 10 knots of tailwind. The captain aimed for the touchdown zone, but just missed it, touching down about 80 feet beyond it, 1,580 feet into the 8,000 feet long runway. He then deployed their single operational thrust reverser, and the auto brake soon kicked in, but the spoilers initially didn't deploy since the first officer had forgotten to arm them, reducing the brake effectiveness quite a lot. After 3 or 4 seconds or so, a safety feature detected that the plane was now on the ground with the wheels spinning up and with a thrust reverser selected, but without the spoilers deployed, so it now automatically deployed them. But at 180 knots ground speed, a plane travels a long way in 3 to 4 seconds. At around this time, the captain also noticed that they weren't slowing down and started applying max manual braking, but to his horror, this seemed to have almost no effect. The fact was that the plane was now experiencing viscous hydroplaning, sliding along the slippery runway with its tires only barely in contact with the runway. And in situations like that, the aircraft anti-skid system will kick in and reduce brake pressure to keep the wheels from skidding. So no matter how much he was pushing on the brakes, they just weren't working. At the same time, the asymmetric thrusts from the only operating thrust reverser also threatened to pull them to the right, forcing the captain to correct with the rudder, which now created a feedback loop as the plane slid alarmingly left and then right and then back again. It was still barely slowing down at this point and approaching the runway end at a terrifying almost 100 knots or 180 kilometers per hour. Now realizing that they were going to crash, the pilots started screaming, but there was really nothing that they could do. At time 21:42 and 10 seconds, Flight 293 slid off the end of runway 10 at a speed of about 80 knots. It then continued over 350 meters across the grass before striking a seawall at the edge of St. John's River. This impact ripped off the landing gear with a violent jolt, and the airplane then hurtled over the edge and into the water, slamming against the shallow, muddy bottom before lurching to a final stop, just a few meters away from the shoreline. This violent impact had caused minor injuries to several people on board, but all 143 passengers and crew had survived the accident without serious harm. The river was so shallow at this location that the water didn't even rise to the level of the cabin floor, except in the last couple of rows, so there was also no real risk of drowning. The flight attendants now immediately took command of the evacuation, and the passengers disembarked in an orderly fashion, clambering out onto the wings and into life rafts which the crew had inflated, and then those life rafts were dragged to shore by responding firefighters. After having checked the cabin twice for anyone who might have been knocked unconscious, the captain was then the last person to leave the aircraft. And in the end, only a few minor injuries occurred throughout this whole ordeal. But tragically, several pets had been carried in the cargo hold and drowned when the plane's belly became submerged in the river, despite some of the crew members and first responders trying to rescue them. In the months following the crash, the FAA issued a new SAFO, superseding the previous one, urging operators to assume that the runway would be not only wet but contaminated during heavy rain on a grooved runway, or with moderate to heavy rain on an ungrooved runway. The NTSB ultimately found that the cause of the accident was an extreme loss of braking friction due to heavy rain and the water depth on the ungrooved runway, which resulted in viscous hydroplaning. They also noted that while the flight crew's actions were not causal or contributory, the accident would have still been avoided if the pilots would have followed their SOPs and discontinued the unstable approach. On top of that, they added that the omission to arm the spoilers, the high speed on approach and the long landing increased the speed of the airplane when it left the runway and thereby contributed to the severity of the accident. Many of those errors were most likely rooted in Miami Air's operational culture, and for that reason the airline made a long list of operational and training-related changes in an effort to give crews better guidance on and respect for adverse runway conditions. Unfortunately though, just 1 year after this accident, Miami Air went out of business due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, but even though they are not around anymore to incorporate the lessons, this is still an important accident to remember, because runway overruns are one of the only accident types out there that is actually becoming more common today. And ambiguity about things like expected braking action and anticipated landing performance, as well as continuations of unstabilized approaches, all contribute to this problem. Now, I really hope that you liked this video and that you have subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss our next one. And I also hope that you've noticed that we have updated our merch shop with brand new designs, including these cool airport posters. Now, check the store out, and if you can't find your favorite airport, then let us know and we might add it in our next batch. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.